Kessler from the University of New South Wales, who will give another perspective. Put your hands together, please.
Thank you, and I thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for the invitation, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss these matters with my old comrade in arms, Vivian Pujol, because Vivian and I, 20 years ago, were part of a very small and not very popular group of Jewish people before 1993, before Oslo, who argued that the basis, the only conceivable basis for peace in the Middle East, peace between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, was on the basis of a two-state solution that recognized, involved the mutual and equal and reciprocal recognition by two peoples of the historical reality of the other, of an entitlement on that basis to a state expressing the national sovereignty and autonomy of those people, two states that could live together in peace, harmony and cooperation. Hallelujah. I still hold to that position. I think it is the only conceivable future for the Middle East. The difference is that history doesn't go in a straight line, it goes in circles. Favourable moments, or what seem to be favourable moments, appear and then disappear. It seemed at that time that it might just be possible to move some serious way in that direction. That is not where we are now. I still believe that that is the only feasible long-term solution based upon conciliation and reconciliation between the national claims of these two peoples in a single land of two peoples. The national claims each to its own state. I think we're a lot further from that objective than it seemed we might be 20 years ago. I don't see it being achieved. I don't see how it will be achieved. I don't expect to see it achieved in my own lifetime, but I still believe that is the only way that this problem can conceivably be resolved. Now, who believes in that two-state solution, substantively? Well, I do, and I know from survey data that a majority of the Israelis will support a two-state solution if they have confidence that it is serious, there is serious commitment to it from the other side. And I can also tell you that on the basis of serious survey research done last week, not by Israel, but by the leading Palestinian public opinion surveys units at the Palestinian universities in Jerusalem, there is also, among the Palestinian people in the West Bank, a clear and decided majority in favour of accepting of such and creating and making possible of achieving that two-state solution. Well then, who doesn't believe in it? And I can tell you that there are two people who quite clearly don't, or two entities. One is Hamas, that is absolutely opposed to it, on religiously informed communitarian sacralized grounds, and the other is the Fatah, the PLO, the West Bank Authority, that has always been, unlike Hamas, has always prevaricated and fudged on what its real position is on this question, but it is made clear that that is not its position, and it is now at least increasingly explicit that that is not its position, the two-state solution, working seriously towards it, but more the Hamas position in the present context of a great conciliation, a rapprochement, not between Palestinians and Israelis, but between Fatah and Hamas. And both those organizations have as part of their charter that the solution to the Palestinian problem, the ensuring of the rights of the Palestinians, involves the obliteration of all surviving structures, frameworks and remnants of Jewish sovereignty between the Jordan and the Mediterranean.
Yes, exactly.
Now, for a long time, and Vivian and I were on the barricades together on this, I used to take the position that so long as the Israelis had their state and the Palestinians did not yet have theirs, there was a certain sense in the Palestinians maintaining that in their charter, and that perhaps one shouldn't demand too peremptorily the changing of that charter until the Palestinians achieved or came close to the achievement of their own state. I no longer hold that position because since then the Palestinians have had a large number of opportunities to get that from, as offered by Rabin and fudged by Arafat, as offered by Prime Minister Barak in 2000, as offered by those who had opposed bitterly in Israel Rabin and Barak on recognition of the two-state solution, including Sharon, Olmert, Netanyahu, who torpedoed Israeli support for such a thing because of their own squabbles among themselves on the right in Israeli politics. But they did it. But even they have now come to recognise that is the way forward. And they've not only made that as a recognition on paper or in words, they have done it in actions. Sharon, the great military hero, Olmert, have made clear withdrawals, signalling from Gaza, from areas before that south of Gaza, in other areas, signalling quite clearly that if and when there is sincere commitment on the other side, that while Israel will wish to hold on to those parts of what had been across the so-called 1947 Green Line that they have thickened by demographic consolidation, they've also made it quite clear, signalled a readiness to withdraw from those areas of settlement in the so-called West Bank. And where they will not withdraw, they have made quite clear proposals that everybody knows about for fair and equitable swaps, so that the Palestinian state will receive in exchange territories and contiguous, adjacent, consolidatable territories, and not a patchwork of cantonments, to make that can become the basis of a viable, functioning Palestinian state. So those offers have been made, yet, but the refusal, and I'll come into the reasons why in a moment, but the refusal has been on the Palestinian side, both to modify the charters and to take serious substantive steps towards that. It has always been a story of prevarication or taqiyya, the word for righteous political dissimulation in the interest of the promotion and protection of Islam. And that is what has been going on. Now, I didn't want to review the whole history of this. I was talking about Israel and Gaza, and I just want to say, first of all, that the position, nobody likes to see death, slaughter, warfare, and warfare when it occurs is always ugly, and there are always innocent bystanders and civilians, and it's never nice. That said, the situation that occurred in 2012 with Gaza was the same as that occurred in 2008 from the north in Lebanon. Hezbollah in 2008 launched a sophisticated rocket assault from the north. In 2012, Hamas gradually built up a crude rocket assault from the south, from Gaza. And what happens in such a case? The primary right and duty and responsibility of any state is to protect its citizens, has the right to preserve its national security and autonomy. This is an elementary point. And that is why I say, before we get on to any of the other aspects about Israel and Gaza, since we're talking in a context that has a United Nations co-sponsorship, so to speak, I understand the politics in today's world and how majorities work in the United Nations. But as a matter of principle, I find it puzzling, shameful and disgraceful that the United Nations as a body, faced with this problem, does not base its entire approach first and foremost upon recognising the absolute right of a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations, to self-defence. More than that, I take a step further. Palestine wishes to have a state. It wishes to enjoy its own place in the world, ultimately as a member of the United Nations. Now, the world community, world society, is a community, an association, a comity, a network of nation states. That's what international society is. And to have a plausible claim to be a member of that state, you have to accept, of that organisation, of that order, you have to accept its principle, which is the recognition of the right of self-determination, self-protection of autonomous states. Not only do members do that, but if you are seeking membership, if you are a candidate member as the Palestine or the prospective Palestinian state is, it must act in that way. It must act as if it were a member and fundamentally accept that whatever its reservations with an existing sovereign state, it must recognise that state as part of the United Nations, the world order centred upon the United Nations, and deal with it on those terms. But that is not what is going on. If you're fighting for recognition of place within a world order of nation states, international society, then if that is what you're doing, as a candidate member you must respect and uphold, not subvert, that world order, its underlying principles and fundamental presuppositions. And yet, in the case of the Palestinians, somehow or other, this is not expected and this is not demanded. It is not required of them by international society, and on the contrary, when Israel defends itself somehow or other, and finds ways of doing so successfully, they say, oh, this is terrible, the Israelis have defended themselves and so few of them got killed. Well, look, it's not pretty, people get killed, but people have been killed in a context where where, particularly from Gaza, Hamas has insisted on absolutely not recognising Israel, not recognising this fundamental United Nations principle, has insisted on firing low-grade crude rockets and tunnelling into Gaza. And we know the stories of kidnapped soldiers and all the rest of it. It is not a pretty story. And any society and any nation state that can defend itself against that, well, good luck to them. If we here in Sydney were faced with a similar thing of rocket attacks here from the other side of Broadway, of people tunnelling, there is nobody here that would deny, even if it was from those strange people over in North Sydney, nobody would deny our right to defend ourselves against them if they were lobbing rockets across or building extra tunnels next to the harbour tunnel next to the harbour bridge to come into this side of the city and blow people up, kidnap people. Now, why does the Palestinian side not accept this? And fundamentally it goes back. It's fundamentally a religious matter. Because ultimately, before we get to the history, Islam sees itself as the religion, God's own religion, that most closely accords with divinely created human nature. Therefore, in principle, and this is quite explicit in Hamas ideology, and is also part in both religious and in a secularized form among Fatah. If that's the case, then anybody is in principle, or prospectively, or ideally a Muslim. It's just some people, through no fault of their own, get born into the wombs of women who are of other faiths, Christians, whatever. But ultimately, they are, if they were to come in accord with their own true nature, they would become Muslims. That is what they are to do. And once they have done so, it's irreversible. They have returned to their true nature and it cannot be reversed. That is their fitra. That is their divinely created human ontology. And the same principle then applies to land. Whatever the history, once a piece of land has come into Muslim possession, so they say, it can never be released, returned, surrendered, passed back. Now, one has to put this together with another fundamental religious belief in Islam, that Islam, the supersessionist belief that Islam is the continuation, the completion, the perfection of Abrahamic monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all that's good in the earlier forms lives on in Islam. Therefore, the real Islam is now the real Judaism and the real Christianity. That's why some people would notice on buses, Jesus, prophet of Islam, around here. Nobody understands what they mean by it. And that is why then Jewish religion is recognized as a historic relic of earlier pre-Islamic times, as an incomplete, imperfect, crippled, lame, and subsequently corrupted version of the monotheistic revelation. But after that has no religious validity, and Jews may be allowed to live, for example, as Jews, but they have no right to act as Jews publicly in public society, in the world, certainly not in the modern world. There is no right to an autonomous Jewish politics of any kind within this Islamic dispensation, and certainly not to a Jewish dispensation to affirm their identity, as so many other peoples have done in modern history, in national terms, to express them in national terms, and to redefine a religious or an ethnic or a cultural identity in political terms, in national terms, in the forms of a nationalist movement, which is what Zionism is. Instead, you do Google anything about Zionism from the Islamic world, it's all the protocols of the elders of Zion, this whole Tsarist, fraud fabrication that says there are 12 Jews somewhere or other, set up by the Rothschilds that are trying to control the whole world. Now let's get back to a little bit on the Palestinian claim goes to say, basically, we Palestinians have been here forever, which is not true. Palestinian as a people was formed historically, an identity only in the 19th century. And just as Jews came to the particularly after 1870, if you look at Palestinian demography, large parts of what we now call the Palestinian population are people who moved from those parts of the Ottoman Empire that were being taken away from them, in Bosnia, in the Balkans, also in Chechnya. Large parts of many Palestinian villages are equally based upon immigration to Palestine in the 19th century, born of the same 19th century world crisis that created crisis in the European states, in response to which many Jews decided that they would have to redefine their identity in national political terms as Zionists, which then was claimed, well look, our identity goes back to a historic past in Israel and Palestine, let us go there. Now, the Palestinians, the Muslims say, we have been here forever, but Jewish identity is a fraud. It's an amazing, there's no such thing, there's no Jewish history. They deny everything about, nobody was there. Well, what you have to understand, first there's been unbroken, parlous at times, there's been an unbroken demographic Jewish presence in Israel, Palestine since biblical times, even despite the Roman effort to clear everybody out. There has been massive, there's been certainly from the Middle Ages, the return of all the mystics and Kabbalists to the northern city of Sfat, to Jerusalem. They were not a majority in the land, but they were certainly represented major demographic centres. But the crucial thing, the crucial refutation of the Palestinian Hamas-Pilot position is not from anything I say or what it is to be found in Islam's own history and historiography. The Prophet Muhammad was born in about 570. He left Mecca in 622. That's when Islamic history begins. He sets up Islam as an independent political, religious and political community in Mecca, 622. 632, he dies. And then begins the period of the so-called four righteous caliphs, the idealized period, except the four righteous caliphs, most of them died by being killed off, but by whom we won't go. But the greatest perhaps of them was the second righteous caliph, the Caliph Umar, who in 638, meaning Islamic society and civilization had barely begun. In 638, 6 years after the death of Muhammad, 16 years after the foundation of Mecca, which was the establishment of Islam as a human socio-political community, the basis of Islamic. In 638, the Caliph Umar conquered Jerusalem, built the Mosque of Umar. If you look at all the Quranic verses around it, it's got nothing to do with attacking Jews, it's attacking those terrible Christians for their Trinitarian beliefs. But the standard Islamic historiography records that the keys of the city were given in gratitude to the great man, the Caliph Umar, by Sophronius, the Byzantine, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, and was welcomed by the large Jewish community, the Jewish population of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, who felt they'd had a bad deal under the Byzantines and looked for better times under the Muslims. Okay, but none of that counts. So long as there's a commitment to this notion that somehow or other Palestine has always been Jew-free, that Jewish history has no reality, that Jews are a historical relic of the pre-Islamic religious history of humankind, but have no social and political standing in the world. So long as that continues, it's going to be rather difficult to resolve the problem. Now, getting back to Gaza, yes, it's asymmetrical. Asymmetrical warfare refers to terrorism. How the powers of the weak. He's not saying Israel is being asymmetrical because it's using its capacity to defend itself. The notion of asymmetrical war is how do the weak prevail? Through terror. And we'll get on to how this works in a moment. But first, if one looks at, nobody likes seeing the suffering, the destruction in Gaza, but if you look at all the statistics, gone through it. Now the United Nations people admit that rockets were fired from a United Nations installation in the Gaza Strip. Significant leading BBC journalists, BBC and others have said that Hamas prevented them from reporting. They could not report till they left the Gaza Strip. Those who tried to do were intimidated, beaten up and worse. Also, in the the counting of the victims, the way it worked was the main activist Islamic military groups came and claimed their soldiers and said, we'll give them a military burial. They said, everyone else is a civilian. But if you look closely, as some people have done, it turns out that the best guess you can make is that the relative proportion is round about 50-50. 50% people who were one way or another involved in support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other Islamist groups, and 50% were these terrible, genuine innocent bystanders, including, of course, children. Now that is horrible. Nobody likes to look at it. But I ask you just very personal to look at what happened at the Normandy invasion. Have you seen the statistics? About 50-50. Half the people who died at the Normandy invasion were French civilians. Similarly, at the landing of the Dutch bridge at Nijmegen, half the people who died were civilians. And if you go back in European history, this is not just a function of modern technology and its indiscriminate operation. The ratios of civilian casualties in the 30 Years' War were far, far worse than that. Yet, what happens is, of course, these things are filmed, photographed. It is a media war. The anarchists used to talk about the propaganda of the deed. In an earlier, simpler times, the deed communicated itself. I'll finish in a moment, okay? The deed communicated itself. The deed was self-communicating. Now, in an era of new media sophistication, media saturation with its own naivete, we have the propaganda of the manipulated, massaged, the contrived deed, the cynically staged imagery, image trickery, image fraud, and fraudulent iconography. Now known because a lot of the pictures have gone out, supposedly from Gaza, are photographs that have been taken of Sunni Shia sectarian violence in Iraq. It sounds horrible. In other words, we are dealing here with, we are being driven, and we've got to be aware of this, to a kind of moral outrage based on the politics of propaganda, of the staged media moment, of the contrived and confected yet politically powerful, compelling political imagery. I will finish soon, but let me make just a couple of final points. We in the West imagine, many of us, and the entire Islamic world now believes, that Israel now exists because out of European guilt, of what had gone before, Europe consented to the creation of Israel, and people have now become aware of what happened to the Palestinians, and it is now guilt about guilt. And this is the dominant political mood, this is the time, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it. People now feel an enormous guilt towards the Palestinians of what happened to the Palestinians based upon what they did, out of a belated recognition of what had been done by Christendom and post-Christian Christendom, namely Europe, over a long period, but particularly in the years, the inaction during the years when Hitler rose to power. And it's talked about as if all this started in 1948, as if there was no Jewish presence, no national Israeli, no national Jewish presence, no culture in Palestine before that. This is simply wrong. Apart from which, if you go back to the mandate, in 1922, that great political romantic, Winston Churchill, cut off 5/6 of the mandate, namely Jordan, to give to King Abdullah, on the understanding that there would be a sufficient space then on the other side of the Jordan for a serious effort to be made to realise certain those objectives of Jewish self-determination, whatever it was going to be in Palestine. Now, people seem to think that Israel happened only because there was a Balfour Declaration that in 1948 everybody felt so guilty, and this is an alternative history that has no relation to the truth. It wouldn't be the history if only the Zionist movement in 1903 had accepted the offer when Jews were being persecuted in Tsarist Russia. To say, forget about Palestine, we'll give you Uganda. Or big sway that, fortunately, particularly I thought during Idi Amin's time, it's very good that the Zionist movement said, no, we don't want to do that to the Africans, closer to home. There was a huge movement to set up a Jewish homeland, he said, in the Kimberleys. Yeah. Can you imagine what the land rights situation we'd now if Israel was sitting out there at Tananara? Thank you very much. So, the whole notion, there's a view of the situation that simply turns upon a peculiar history. Now finally, if people here still believe want to insist and believe that the Palestinians and the Palestinians alone are the original inhabitants, the sole original inhabitants of Israel-Palestine. And again, if people here in Australia sincerely believe that land must be returned absolutely and unconditionally to their originally possessing inhabitants, then I say, stop this hypocrisy. Stop lecturing Israel about Palestine. Start here. First, in the name of this country's national decency, by returning this land to its original Aboriginal possessors, and we should all go back to Europe or where it is where we come from and leave the land. We should do it now, and we should stop the farce and stop this Jewish exceptionalism again of saying this principle doesn't apply to anybody else, but somehow it's got to apply to those Jews over there in Israel. Okay, do it, start here, and if not, not. If we're not prepared to start charity and justice at home, then we've got no business lecturing anything at our. And while I'm in the business here of encouraging realism, just one more thing. As ISIL rampages across northern Syria and western Iraq, and as scores are killed daily in bombings and sectarian mayhem in Iraq, and while Hezbollah plays and wrecks both Lebanon and Syria, and while Hamas murders and maims those in the Gaza Strip who decline to accept its zealous leadership, the world, I suggest, out of basic realism and decency, should now say quite clearly, should acknowledge that Israel and its efforts to maintain itself, to defend its national sovereignty, are not the cause, and not the cause of the Middle East problems, although it's a serious problem that must be resolved. It is not the source of the great threat to world peace and security in the Middle East. It is not the greatest moral outrage in the Middle East. And those Palestinians who have the option of living under Palestinian rule in the West Bank, or living with all its disadvantages and disabilities, which I admit as members of the Palestinian minority in Israel, but as Israeli citizens, they vote with their feet. They would rather live in Israel than in Palestine. And if you're going to respect Palestinian expressions of opinion, that I suggest is one kind of Palestinian opinion that deserves to be recognised and taken seriously. Thank you.